Tony Bennett sat in his Central Park West apartment, staring at the severance check he had just signed for Rebecca Martinez, his personal assistant of 15 years. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the check on his mahogany desk, not from age, but from the weight of what he had just been forced to do. Rebecca had been more than an assistant. She had been the invisible architect of his daily life, the person who knew his schedule better than he did, who remembered the names of every journalist's children, who could predict his needs before he articulated them. She had been privy to every phone call, every meeting, every private moment of vulnerability that came with being 97 years old and still trying to maintain a public career. But yesterday, Tony's accountant, David Stern, had presented him with evidence that was impossible to ignore. Over the past 2 years, $340,000 had been systematically transferred from Tony's accounts to a private account belonging to Rebecca Martinez. The transfers had been small enough to avoid immediate detection, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, but consistent enough to constitute a devastating pattern of theft. "Mr. Bennett," David had said, his voice heavy with regret, "I'm sorry to have to show you this, but Rebecca has been stealing from you for years. The evidence is overwhelming." Tony had stared at the bank records in disbelief. Rebecca, who had organized his birthday parties, who had been the first person to call when he won his final Grammy, who had held his hand during his wife Susan's cancer treatments. This Rebecca was supposed to be a thief? But the numbers didn't lie. The transfers were clearly documented, and they all traced back to Rebecca's personal accounts, which showed corresponding deposits on the exact same dates. The confrontation had been heartbreaking. When Tony presented Rebecca with the evidence, her face had gone white, then red, then dissolved into tears. But she hadn't denied it. "Mr. Bennett," she had whispered, "I can explain. It's not what it looks like." "Then explain it to me, Rebecca. Help me understand how this isn't theft." But Rebecca's explanation had only made things worse. She claimed that the money had been intended as loans to help with her mother's medical expenses, loans that she had fully intended to repay but had never formally documented or received permission for. "You never asked me," Tony had said, his voice breaking. "In 15 years, you never once asked me for help. If you had told me your mother was sick, if you had explained your financial problems, I would have helped you. I would have given you the money, Rebecca. You didn't need to steal it." "I was embarrassed," Rebecca had replied, still crying. "I didn't want you to see me as someone who couldn't handle her own problems. I thought I could pay it back before anyone noticed." But embarrassment didn't justify theft, and Tony had been forced to let her go. He couldn't have someone in his inner circle whom he couldn't trust, someone who had violated the most basic principle of their professional relationship. And now, 12 hours later, Tony's phone rang. He recognized the number. It belonged to Vanessa Park, a gossip columnist from the New York Post who had been trying to get dirt on Tony for years. "Mr. Bennett," Vanessa's voice was syrupy sweet with false concern, "I'm calling about Rebecca Martinez. I understand you recently terminated her employment under some rather dramatic circumstances." Tony's blood ran cold. "I don't discuss personnel matters, Miss Park. Rebecca's departure was a private matter." "Oh, but Mr. Bennett, Rebecca is no longer treating it as a private matter. She's been quite forthcoming about the reasons for her dismissal, and, frankly, her version of events paints you in a rather unflattering light." Tony felt his world beginning to tilt. "What do you mean?" "According to Rebecca, you fired her because she refused to participate in covering up some financial irregularities in your charitable foundation. She claims you've been misappropriating funds from the Tony Bennett Foundation for personal use, and that when she threatened to report you to the authorities, you retaliated by framing her for theft." The accusation was so outrageous, so completely false, that Tony initially couldn't even respond. The Tony Bennett Foundation was one of his proudest achievements, providing music education to underserved children throughout New York City. Every penny of the foundation's money was accounted for and audited annually by independent accountants. "That's absolutely false," Tony said finally. "Rebecca was terminated for stealing from my personal accounts. I have documentation of every transfer she made." "Interesting," Vanessa said, and Tony could hear her typing furiously in the background. "Because Rebecca has documentation too. Bank records showing transfers from the foundation to your personal accounts, correspondence discussing the cover-up, even audio recordings of conversations where you allegedly admitted to the fraud." Tony felt sick. "Those recordings would have to be fabricated. I never had such conversations because I never committed any fraud." Perhaps. But the court of public opinion doesn't always wait for forensic audio analysis, does it, Mr. Bennett? I'm running the story tomorrow morning. Would you like to comment? Tony hung up the phone and immediately called David Stern. "David, we have a problem. Rebecca is claiming that I fired her for threatening to expose fraud at the foundation, and she apparently has documentation supporting her claims." David was quiet for a long moment. "That's impossible, Tony. I audit the foundation accounts quarterly. There's no fraud, but what? Rebecca had access to all of your accounts, including the foundation accounts. If she wanted to create false evidence of transfers between the foundation and your personal accounts, she would have had the technical ability to do so." Tony felt a growing sense of dread. "Are you saying she could have fabricated bank records?" "I'm saying that someone with her level of access and technical knowledge could potentially manipulate online banking records in ways that would be difficult to detect immediately. It would require a full forensic audit to prove the documents were false." "How long would that take?" "Weeks, maybe months." Tony realized the terrible genius of Rebecca's strategy. By the time he could prove her evidence was fabricated, the damage to his reputation would be irreversible. The story of a beloved 97-year-old entertainer stealing from a children's charity would dominate news cycles for months. Over the next 48 hours, Tony watched his life unravel with horrifying speed. Vanessa Park's article, titled "Bennett Foundation Under Fire: Did Tony Bennett Steal from Children?" was picked up by every major news outlet. The story painted Rebecca as a courageous whistleblower who had risked her career to expose corruption by a beloved public figure who had used his reputation to hide his crimes. The article included excerpts from what appeared to be audio recordings of Tony discussing the foundation fraud, bank records showing transfers from the foundation to Tony's personal accounts, and emotional quotes from Rebecca about her moral dilemma and her ultimate decision to come forward despite the personal cost. Within hours, the Tony Bennett Foundation was suspended from accepting donations pending investigation. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office announced they were opening a criminal investigation into potential charity fraud. 3 major venues cancelled upcoming Tony Bennett concerts, citing concerns about associating with potential criminal activity. Most devastating of all were the personal betrayals. Friends who had known Tony for decades began calling to express their disappointment. Board members of the foundation resigned to protect their own reputations. Even some family members started asking questions about Tony's finances that suggested they believed he might actually be guilty. Tony spent the first day trying to defend himself publicly, appearing on news programs to deny the allegations and explain that Rebecca had been fired for theft, not for whistleblowing. But his explanations sounded weak and self-serving compared to Rebecca's emotional accounts of her moral struggle. On the second day, Tony's lawyer, Patricia Wells, called with devastating news. "Tony, I've received a letter from Rebecca's attorney. She's demanding $2 million in exchange for admitting that her allegations were false and her evidence was fabricated. Tony was stunned. She's admitting the evidence is fake. In the letter to me, yes. But if you don't pay, she's prepared to maintain her story publicly and in any legal proceedings. She's essentially holding your reputation hostage. Tony felt rage building in his chest. This is extortion. Yes, it is. But proving it would require getting Rebecca to admit to the extortion on record, and her lawyer is too smart to let that happen. Meanwhile, every day this story continues, your reputation suffers more damage. Tony realized that Rebecca had planned this revenge with meticulous care. She had spent 15 years learning everything about his finances, his business relationships, and his vulnerabilities. She had used her position of trust to gather the information she would need to destroy him if she were ever caught stealing. But Tony Bennett had not survived in show business for 70 years by giving in to bullies and extortionists. "Patricia," he said, "I want you to arrange a meeting with Rebecca. Tell her I want to discuss her demands face to face." "Tony, I don't think that's wise." "Anything you say could be recorded and used against you." "Let her record it. I'm 97 years old, Patricia. I've lived through wars, recessions, the rise and fall of entire musical genres, and every kind of industry scandal imaginable. I'm not going to let a thief destroy my legacy with lies." The meeting was arranged for the following evening at Patricia's law office. Rebecca arrived with her attorney, Robert Chen, a slick-looking man in his 40s who specialized in employment law and wrongful termination suits. Tony had expected to feel anger when he saw Rebecca again, but instead he felt only sadness. The woman sitting across from him looked exhausted and defeated, despite the fact that she was supposedly in control of the situation. "Hello, Rebecca," Tony said quietly. "Mr. Bennett." She couldn't meet his eyes. Robert Chen opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Mr. Bennett, my client is prepared to resolve this matter amicably. In exchange for $2 million and a public statement acknowledging that Ms. Martinez was terminated without cause, she will retract her allegations and admit that her evidence was exaggerated." Tony looked directly at Rebecca. "Why, Rebecca? After 15 years, after everything we've been through together, why did you choose to destroy me rather than just disappear quietly?" Rebecca's composure cracked. "Because you destroyed me first. Do you have any idea what it's like to be fired for theft? To have that on your record? I'll never work again, Mr. Bennett. No one will ever trust me with anything important ever again. But you did steal from me. I borrowed money that I was going to pay back. You make millions of dollars, Mr. Bennett. You wouldn't have even missed that money if your accountant hadn't been looking for it." Tony shook his head sadly. "Rebecca, I would have given you that money if you had asked. I would have paid for your mother's medical bills, helped with any financial problems you had. But you chose to take it without asking. And when I found out, you chose to try to ruin my life rather than accept the consequences of your actions. You left me no choice. There's always a choice, Rebecca, and the choice you're making now, trying to extort money from me by destroying my reputation and my charity, is going to destroy you too." Robert Chen leaned forward. "Mr. Bennett, you're in no position to make threats. My client has evidence of your wrongdoing, and she's prepared to present it to authorities and the media, regardless of your cooperation." Tony smiled, and for the first time in days he felt calm. "Mr. Chen, your client has fabricated evidence of wrongdoing that never occurred. She's attempting to extort money from me by threatening my reputation, and she's doing all of this while being recorded." Rebecca and Robert both looked confused. Tony pulled a small device from his jacket pocket. "This is a digital recorder that's been running since I walked into this room. Patricia, are you also recording this conversation? Patricia nodded. Yes, Tony, as is the security system in this building. Tony looked back at Rebecca. So we have your attorney's statement that you're willing to retract your allegations and admit your evidence was fabricated in exchange for money. We have your admission that you stole money from me, and we have your demand for $2 million to stop lying about me. Robert Chen's face had gone white. This meeting is over. Actually, said Patricia, I think it's just beginning. Rebecca, you have two choices. You can publicly retract your false allegations against Mr. Bennett and admit that you fabricated evidence in an attempt to avoid the consequences of your theft, or we will release these recordings to the district attorney's office and charge you with extortion, fraud, and perjury. Rebecca was crying again, but this time Tony felt no sympathy. She had tried to destroy not just his reputation, but a charity that provided music education to children who desperately needed it. Her lies had caused real harm to real people. I want to make a deal, Rebecca whispered. No deals, Tony said firmly. You're going to hold a press conference tomorrow morning. You're going to admit that you stole money from me and that you fabricated evidence to try to frame me for charity fraud. You're going to apologize publicly to the children and families served by the Tony Bennett Foundation. And then you're going to face whatever legal consequences come from your actions. And if I do this, then I won't press additional charges for extortion. The theft charges will stand, but we won't pile on. Rebecca looked at her attorney, who nodded grimly. She had no choice. The press conference the next morning was devastating for Rebecca, but vindicating for Tony. In front of cameras and reporters, Rebecca admitted that she had stolen money from Tony Bennett over a 2-year period. She confessed that when she was caught, she had fabricated evidence of charity fraud to try to shift blame and avoid consequences. She apologized to Tony, to the foundation, and to the children who had been hurt by her lies. The media, which had been so quick to assume Tony's guilt, was slower to acknowledge their error. But gradually, the narrative shifted. Tony Bennett was no longer the corrupt celebrity who had stolen from children. He was the victim of an elaborate revenge scheme by a disgruntled employee. The district attorney's office dropped their investigation into the foundation and instead focused on Rebecca's crimes. She eventually pleaded guilty to theft and was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to Tony. But the damage to Tony's reputation, while not permanent, was significant. Some people continued to believe that where there was smoke, there must be fire. Concert bookings were slower to return to normal levels. Donations to the foundation, while eventually restored, took months to recover. Tony learned painful lessons about trust, about the vulnerability that comes with aging in the public eye, and about how quickly a lifetime of good work can be threatened by someone who knows exactly where to strike. But he also learned about resilience, about the power of truth eventually prevailing, and about the importance of having people in your life who know your character well enough to stand by you when lies threaten to overwhelm facts. On the night after Rebecca's sentencing, Tony sat in his apartment looking at applications for new personal assistants. Patricia had screened dozens of candidates, but Tony found himself reluctant to trust anyone with the level of access that Rebecca had enjoyed. His phone rang. It was Patricia. "Tony, there's someone here to see you. She says she has information about Rebecca that you need to hear." "What kind of information?" "She says Rebecca wasn't acting alone. She says the theft and the revenge scheme were planned by someone else, and Rebecca was just the person who carried it out." Tony felt a familiar chill. Send her up. As he waited for this mysterious visitor, Tony realized that his ordeal might not be over. If Rebecca had been working with someone else, If this had been part of a larger scheme to destroy him, then firing his assistant might have been just the beginning of a much more dangerous game. The doorbell rang, and Tony prepared himself for whatever revelation was about to unfold. At 97, he had thought he was too old for new enemies and elaborate conspiracies. But apparently, when you've lived in the public eye for as long as Tony Bennett had, there's always someone else waiting in the shadows, ready to try to bring you down. The question was, who had been pulling Rebecca's strings? And what did they really want from Tony Bennett? The woman who entered Tony's apartment was in her 30s, professionally dressed, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his living space. She carried a leather briefcase and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Sarah Caldwell. I'm a private investigator, and I've been tracking a sophisticated extortion ring that targets elderly celebrities. Rebecca Martinez was one of their operatives, but she wasn't the mastermind." Tony gestured for Sarah to sit down. "What kind of extortion ring?" Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "For the past 5 years, someone has been recruiting personal assistants, accountants, and other trusted employees of aging celebrities. These people are placed in positions of trust, where they gradually gain access to financial information, personal secrets, and compromising material. And then they steal money and try to frame their employers when they're caught?" "Not exactly," Sarah said, spreading photographs across Tony's coffee table. "The theft is just the beginning. The real goal is to force the celebrity into a position where they have to choose between public humiliation and paying large sums of money for silence." Tony studied the photographs. They showed other celebrities he recognized, actors, musicians, writers, all of them elderly, all of them looking haggard and defeated. "These people have all been through what you just experienced?" "Or worse," Sarah confirmed. "The scheme is sophisticated. The operatives are trained to document everything: financial irregularities, personal conversations, family secrets. When they're eventually caught stealing, they use this information to create elaborate revenge scenarios designed to destroy their targets unless significant payments are made." "Who's behind it?" Sarah hesitated. "Someone who has very personal reasons for targeting you specifically, Mr. Bennett. Someone who has been planning this for decades." Tony felt a chill of recognition. "Vincent Torino's family?" Sarah nodded grimly. "Vincent Torino Jr., Vincent's son. He's been planning revenge against you since his father's organization collapsed in the 1970s. He blames you for his father's downfall and his family's loss of power in the entertainment industry." Tony remembered Vincent Torino Sr., the mob figure who had tried to control his early career. Tony had managed to escape Vincent's influence in the 1960s, but apparently the family had never forgotten or forgiven. "Vincent Jr. has been building this extortion network specifically to target you and other entertainers who crossed his father. Rebecca was recruited 3 years ago, not 15 years ago. Her first 12 years working for you were legitimate, but 3 years ago, Vincent's people approached her about her mother's medical bills and offered her a solution. They paid her mother's medical expenses in exchange for her cooperation. More than that, they threatened her mother's life if she didn't cooperate. Rebecca wasn't just stealing money, Mr. Bennett. She was documenting everything about your life, your finances, your relationships, your vulnerabilities. The theft was designed to be discovered eventually. The real goal was to gather enough information to destroy you completely." Tony felt sick as he realized the scope of the conspiracy. "How many other people in my life are working for Vincent?" "We're still investigating, but we believe the network includes at least 3 other people in your inner circle. People who have been feeding information to Vincent for years." Sarah pulled out another set of documents. "Your accountant, David Stern has been receiving payments from a shell company controlled by Vincent Torino Jr. for the past 18 months. Tony's world tilted. David had been the one to discover Rebecca's theft. David had been the one to insist that Tony fire her immediately, without giving her a chance to explain or make restitution. David set up Rebecca to be caught. David was instructed to discover the theft at a specific time, when Vincent's people were ready to launch the revenge scenario. If you had discovered Rebecca's theft earlier, before they had gathered enough compromising information about you, the plan wouldn't have worked. Tony realized that his trusted accountant had been manipulating him, timing the revelation of Rebecca's theft to maximize the damage it could cause. David had probably been feeding information to Vincent's organization for months, learning about Tony's schedule, his finances, his vulnerabilities. Who else is involved? Sarah consulted her notes. Your driver, Marcus Chen, has been reporting your movements and conversations to Vincent's people. Your housekeeper, Elena Rodriguez, has been photographing personal documents and private correspondence. Even your physician, Dr. Harold Myers, has been sharing information about your health and medications. Tony felt betrayed and violated. The people he had trusted most, the people who had intimate access to his daily life, had been spying on him for a criminal organization. Every conversation, every private moment, every vulnerability had been documented and reported. How long have you been investigating this? 2 years. It started when several elderly celebrities came forward with similar stories. They had all experienced the same pattern: trusted employees caught stealing, elaborate revenge schemes involving fabricated evidence, demands for large payments to avoid public humiliation. Sarah pulled out a final set of documents. But Vincent Torino Jr. made a mistake. He kept detailed records of the operation, including financial records of payments to his operatives and recordings of conversations where he discussed the revenge plot against you specifically. You have evidence of the conspiracy? Enough to put Vincent and most of his operatives in prison for decades. The FBI has been building a case for months, waiting for the right moment to move against the entire network. Tony understood now why Rebecca's extortion attempt had been so quickly exposed. The FBI had been monitoring the operation, waiting to gather evidence against all the participants. What happens now? Tomorrow morning, the FBI will arrest Vincent Torino Jr., David Stern, Marcus Chen, Elena Rodriguez, Dr. Myers, and 12 other operatives working for the extortion network. You'll be asked to testify about your experiences, but you're a victim, not a target of the investigation. Tony felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the conspiracy was being dismantled, but sadness that so many trusted people had betrayed him. What about Rebecca? Sarah shook her head. Rebecca was coerced initially, but she embraced the role once she understood the payoff. The recordings show someone enthusiastic about destroying you. Her mother's medical bills were paid off 2 years ago, but Rebecca continued because she wanted revenge and money. Tony realized his decision to limit charges against Rebecca had been based on incomplete information. How many other celebrities are involved? 17 that we know of. The network has been operating for 5 years, targeting aging entertainers with significant wealth and reputations vulnerable to scandal. Sarah stood up. Mr. Bennett, I need to warn you. Vincent knows the FBI is closing in, and he may try one final attempt to hurt you before he's arrested. Until tomorrow morning, consider yourself in danger. Tony felt a familiar chill. Even at 97, even after surviving everything that life and his enemies had thrown at him, he was still not safe. What kind of danger? Vincent has access to a lot of desperate people who owe him money or favors. He might try to have you hurt or killed, both as revenge and as a way to prevent you from testifying against him. The FBI has arranged for protection, but you should be very careful about who you trust and where you go. As Sarah left, Tony realized his ordeal was far from over. Tomorrow would bring arrests and justice, but tonight he was alone with the knowledge that trusted people had been systematically betraying him. Tony walked to his window and looked out at Central Park, wondering how many other enemies were waiting in the shadows. At 97, he had thought he was too old for conspiracies and revenge plots. The phone rang, and Tony hesitated before answering. "Hello. Mr. Bennett, this is Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI. Vincent Torino Jr. escaped surveillance this evening. We believe he's planning something tonight. You're not safe in your apartment." Tony felt his blood run cold. "What do you want me to do?" "We're sending agents to escort you to a safe location. Don't trust anyone else who comes to your door tonight." As Tony waited for the FBI agents, he reflected on his life's strange trajectory. From a young singer in 1950s New York, to a target of organized crime, to a beloved entertainer, and now to a 97-year-old hiding from enemies planning his destruction for decades. But Tony Bennett had survived everything for nearly a century. He had outlasted Vincent Sr., and he would outlast Vincent Jr. The music would continue. The truth would prevail. The doorbell rang, and Tony prepared for whatever was coming. He had learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's continuing to sing, continuing to trust, even when caution tells you to stop. Tonight, Tony would face whatever Vincent Jr. had planned. And tomorrow, if he survived, he would continue being Tony Bennett, because that was who he was and who he had always been.